Engines on. Prepare for takeoff.
Japanese commanders, blinded by a year of perceived naval supremacy, laughed. They openly mocked the clumsy American B-25 Mitchell bomber, dismissing it as a lumbering nuisance. They had no idea that very bomber, transformed into a terrifying 8-gun monster, was about to come screaming across the waves, ripping their ships to shreds in the treacherous waters of the Bismarck Sea. For them, it was just another routine mission. 8 transports crammed with men and vital supplies, guarded by 4 destroyers steaming west from Rabaul. This wasn't merely a convoy. It was a defiant fist, meant to reinforce their desperate foothold in New Guinea, to keep the relentless pressure on Australia, and to once again proclaim the invincible dominion of the Imperial Navy over the vast Pacific. What force on earth, they wondered, could possibly stop them? But the Pacific in 1943 was a far cry from the Pacific of 1942. The brutal tide of war was shifting slowly, yet with an undeniable, terrifying inevitability. The Japanese, trapped in their ironclad assumptions of power, had yet to grasp just how perilously dangerous their overconfidence had become. They sailed onward, oblivious, convinced of their untouchable strength, failing to see the dark, ominous clouds gathering on the horizon. A new breed of warrior, armed with desperate ingenuity and a terrifyingly radical plan, was already in motion. The era of predictable warfare was over, and the very sky above the Bismarck Sea was about to rain down a storm of lead and fire unlike anything they could possibly conceive. Their laughter would soon turn to screams, their confidence to utter despair. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine naval warfare, born from the audacity of a few and the arrogant complacency of many. The tide was shifting slowly but unmistakably, and the Japanese didn't yet realize how dangerous their assumptions had become. At this point in the war, Japan was desperate to hold New Guinea. Lae was their critical stronghold, the stepping stone for any further push toward Port Moresby and eventually northern Australia. If Lae fell, their entire eastern flank would be exposed. So the convoy that left Rabaul in late February wasn't just carrying soldiers and crates of ammunition. It was carrying Japan's hope of keeping New Guinea under their control. On paper, it looked formidable. Nearly 7,000 men, packed into troop transports, destroyers, armed with torpedoes, and heavy guns shielding them. A screen of Zero fighters promised to ward off any Allied aircraft that dared to interfere. Japanese commanders, remembering how American bombers had been clumsy at sea attacks, believed their defenses were solid. They weren't afraid. If anything, they were confident, too confident. But across the sea, on dusty airstrips in Papua Allied, commanders had other plans. The U.S. 5th Air Force under General George Kenney had been experimenting with something radical, almost reckless. Kenney and his maverick engineer, Paul "Pappy" Gunn, had grown tired of watching bombers miss moving ships with high-altitude drops. They needed something new, something lethal. Gunn's solution was brutal in its simplicity. Rip out the glass nose of the B-25 Mitchell bomber and cram as many 50-caliber machine guns into it as possible. 8 in the nose, plus more inside packs. Then train the crews to fly low, dangerously low, barely skimming the waves, strafing decks and planting bombs like torpedoes. It sounded suicidal. Flying at mast height left almost no margin for error. One mistake and you were in the water. One lucky shot from an enemy gunner, and you were a fireball skipping across the surface. But Kenney believed it could work, and Gunn had shown it could be done. As the Japanese convoy steamed south from Rabaul, Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted it. Grimy photographs came back, showing ship after ship, bristling with men and cargo heading toward Lae. The reports caused a stir. This was the chance the Allies had been waiting for. A major Japanese force vulnerable on the open sea, just within striking distance. The plan that followed was audacious. Australians from No. 30 Squadron would sweep in with bowfighters, first raking decks with cannon fire. They would go in low, close enough to see faces on the ships. Then the modified B-25 seconds of the 38th Bomb Group would come roaring and strafing and skip bombing with devastating precision. Behind them, A-20 seconds and even heavier bombers would finish the job. It would be a coordinated strike unlike anything tried before in the Pacific. For the men preparing their aircraft on those hot, dusty strips, it was both terrifying and exhilarating. Pilots joked about the gunship noses as mechanics bolted the final mounts. Some ground crewmen muttered prayers as they watched squadrons line up for takeoff. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a standard bombing run. This was something new, untested, and nobody could predict how it would turn out. The Japanese, meanwhile, sailed on unaware. Their commanders sat confidently convinced their Zeros would handle anything the Allies threw at them. A few whispered concerns about long-range bombers or submarines, but they were brushed aside. After all, what had the Americans ever done to prove they could destroy a well-guarded convoy at sea? That assumption would cost them dearly, because the very thing they mocked, the medium B-25, was about to show them it could. Tear ships apart like a giant saw cutting through wood. But before the guns blazed and the bombs skipped the convoy, first had to leave Rabaul and plunge into danger, unaware that death was waiting just beyond the horizon. On the morning of February 28, 1943, the port of Rabaul stirred with activity. Soldiers clambered up gangways, officers barked orders, and cranes swung crates of ammunition and fuel drums into the holds of waiting transports. The Japanese convoy that would later be remembered in history as the Bismarck Sea convoy was finally preparing to sail. 8 transport ships stood ready, carrying thousands of men, soldiers, destined for lay laborer supplies, and heavy equipment to strengthen Japan's grip on New Guinea. Surrounding them, destroyers stood watch, bristling with guns, ready to fire at anything that approached. The mood among the Japanese troops was confident. Many of the soldiers had heard of American bombers missing more often than they hit. Stories circulated of clumsy Allied attacks that failed to stop convoys in the Solomon Islands. The presence of their destroyer escorts with their heavy anti-aircraft batteries made the men believe they were safe. Some even joked openly about how the enemy bombers would never dare face their guns head-on. But their optimism didn't erase the realities of life aboard. The transports were crowded. Men slept on wooden planks, rifles stacked beside them, helmets within reach. The humid air clung to everything, the smell of fuel mixing with sweat and damp uniforms. On deck, sailors watched the horizon, aware of the dangers of Allied submarines, but still confident that the destroyers could protect them from them. From the perspective of Japanese naval officers, the mission was straightforward: reinforce Lae, secure the garrison, and keep the path to Port Moresby open. Lae was the hinge in New Guinea, the link between Japan's forward positions and the vital stronghold of Rabaul. If Lae collapsed, the entire northern coastline of New Guinea would be vulnerable. Failure was not an option. As the convoy slipped out of Rabaul harbor and into the Bismarck Sea, lookouts scanned the skies. The weather was in their favor, clouds rolling over the horizon, patches of rain, and the open water stretching wide. Every man on board knew they were entering dangerous territory, but the destroyers cut the waves with confidence, their crews ready to respond to any attack. What the Japanese did not realize was that their departure had already been noted. Allied reconnaissance had eyes on Rabaul almost constantly. Pilots from the Royal Australian Air Force had spotted unusual activity at the harbor. Their photographs, grainy but clear enough, showed transports lined up with troops boarding. Allied analysts quickly estimated the size of the convoy, nearly 7,000 troops heading toward Lae. It was exactly the kind of movement the Allies had been waiting to intercept. Back at the Allied base in Port Moresby, tension grew. Messages crackled over radios relaying the convoy's course. General George Kenney gathered his staff. For months, he had been pressing for a chance like this, an opportunity to put the new low-level attack tactics to the ultimate test. Now, with the convoy at sea, his moment had arrived. Meanwhile, life aboard the transports carried on. Japanese soldiers ate bowls of rice and dried fish, played cards, and tried to pass the time. On one ship, a group of men gathered near the rail, staring out at the waves and joking about how the lumbering American bombers would probably aim too high and miss. None of them could imagine that within days, those same bombers would be screaming toward them at mast height, guns blazing. The destroyer captains, seasoned veterans of naval combat, trusted their anti-aircraft gunners. They knew how to fire at torpedo planes and dive bombers, but the thought of medium bombers charging head-on with a wall of gunfire had never crossed their minds. That possibility simply didn't exist in their calculations. For now the sea was calm. The convoy stretched out across the water, ships steaming in formation, the Japanese flag fluttering proudly. The troops slept uneasily, the sound of engines vibrating through the decks. Above them the sky was empty, only the occasional seabird cutting across the clouds. But in the mountains and jungles of New Guinea, Allied air crews were already preparing. Mechanics tightened bolts on gun mounts, armorers loaded belts of .50 caliber rounds, and pilots sat through briefings that promised something brutal and decisive. The Japanese convoy was moving toward Leh, and the Allies were determined to make sure it never arrived. But before the B-25 seconds and Beaufighters could unleash their fury, the Americans had to gamble on tactics that had never been tested against a convoy of this size. When news of the Japanese convoy reached Allied headquarters, General George Kenney leaned over the operations table in Port Moresby and knew exactly what had to be done. The photographs from reconnaissance confirmed it: 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and nearly 7,000 troops. If that force reached Leh, it would tighten Japan's grip on New Guinea and prolong the brutal struggle for months. To stop it, Kenney had only one real weapon: air power, but not just any kind of air power, something entirely different. Kenney's 5th Air Force had been experimenting, sometimes against orders, with methods that broke every conventional rule. Traditionally, bombers attacked ships from high altitude. It looked impressive: rows of planes and formation bombs falling like rain. But the reality was dismal. Moving ships were hard to hit from that height, and too often the bombs splashed harmlessly into the sea. Even when a hit was scored, ships could keep moving. Kenney wanted something faster, deadlier, and certain. That's where Paul "Pappy" Gunn came in. Gunn wasn't your typical officer. He had been a Navy man, a pilot with a knack for improvisation. By 1943, he was running wild with ideas in New Guinea, modifying planes with the same enthusiasm a hot rod mechanic might show in a garage. He looked at the B-25 Mitchell, considered a medium bomber, not glamorous like the big B-17, and saw potential. Why drop bombs from 1,000 feet? Gunn asked, when you can hit a ship right in the teeth. His idea was simple but radical. Load the nose with guns, not 2 or 4, but 8 heavy, .50 caliber machine guns, firing forward, in one devastating stream. Then train pilots to fly in low, almost scraping the waves, charging straight at enemy ships. First, strafe the decks, shredding gun crews, blinding the enemy, and then release bombs just above the waterline so they skipped like stones before slamming into hulls. The skip bombing technique was daring. It required nerves of steel and absolute precision. Pilots had to descend to just a few hundred feet, release their bombs at the right moment, and pull up before smashing into the ship themselves. Too early, and the bombs skipped harmlessly over. Too late, and the plane risked blowing itself up. Many doubted it could work. Some called it suicidal. But Gunn believed in it, and Kenney backed him. Together they had trained crews of the 38th Bomb Group to try it. By the time the Japanese convoy was spotted, these pilots were ready to put the new tactic to the ultimate test. At the dusty airstrips of New Guinea, the preparations were intense. Mechanics stripped bombers of unnecessary weight, reinforced gun mounts, and checked every last belt of ammunition. Armorers wheeled crates of .50 caliber rounds to the planes, their hands blackened with grease and sweat. Pilots walked around their aircraft, slapping fuselages, running gloved hands along the barrels jutting from the nose. "You really think this is going to work?" One young pilot asked, his voice nervous but edged with excitement. "It better," his squadron leader replied, "because the Japanese aren't going to wait for us to get it right." The Australians of No. 30 Squadron RAAF were also part of the plan. They would go in first with their Bristol Beaufighters, flying even lower than the B-25 seconds, using their 4 20mm cannons to rake ship decks and silence anti-aircraft batteries. Once the ships were distracted and bleeding, the Americans would come storming in with their new gunship bombers. In the command tent, Kenney laid it out for his men. "This convoy is the biggest chance we've had in months. If it gets through, Leh is reinforced. If we stop it, Japan bleeds. We don't get a second shot. Make it count." There was silence for a moment. Every man in the room understood what was at stake. Then someone muttered quietly, "We'll make it count, sir." The gamble wasn't just in the planes or the tactics. It was in asking ordinary men, many barely out of flight school, to do something no one had ever tried on this scale. They would be flying at mast height, aiming at moving ships, bristling with guns, trusting in an idea born in a mechanic's imagination. As the convoy steamed closer to lay Allied pilots strapped into their cockpits, some tucked photographs of wives or children into their jackets. Others kept their thoughts to themselves, gripping throttles and waiting for the signal. Engines roared to life across the airfields, filling the jungle valleys with thunder. Dust swirled in clouds as squadrons lined up for takeoff. The gamble was about to be tested not in theory, but in blood and fire. But before the B-25 seconds roared in to prove their worth, the Australians would strike first, hammering the convoy and setting the stage for the deadliest low-level attack the Pacific had ever seen. On the morning of March 3, 1943, the Japanese convoy cut across the Bismarck Sea in neat formation. The transports plowed forward destroyers, flanking them like watchdogs, their wakes churning the gray-green water. On deck, soldiers leaned over the rails, squinting into the horizon. Some smoked, others lounged on crates. They joked that the Allies wouldn't dare come close in daylight. They were wrong. High above the sea, Allied aircraft were circling into position. The first wave belonged to the Australians. The men of No. 30 Squadron RAAF, flying Bristol Beaufighters, were about to carry out one of the most daring assaults yet attempted. Their job was to go in first before the Americans and shred the enemy defenses. The Beaufighter wasn't elegant. It was heavy, solid, and bristling with firepower, 4 20mm cannons in the nose and 6 303 machine guns in the wings. At mast height, it was terrifying. That morning, its pilots were calm but tense as they adjusted their throttles, checking gun switches, listening to the crackle of orders in their headsets. "All right, boys," one squadron leader said, his voice steady over the radio. "Hit them hard. Don't give them time to breathe." The Beaufighters swooped down out of the sky, hugging the waves so tightly that their propellers sprayed up mist. Japanese lookouts screamed warnings as the black shapes thundered in. Seconds later, the decks of the transports erupted in fire. Cannon shells ripped through bridges, shattered railings, and tore apart anti-aircraft guns before their crews could even fire. Soldiers dove for cover as streams of bullets chewed through lifeboats, cargo, and men alike. Eyewitnesses later said the noise was deafening, a wall of gunfire that seemed endless. As the Beaufighters blasted through the convoy, one Japanese sailor thrown to the deck by the shockwave recalled the horror of seeing his comrades torn apart before they could even reach their weapons. Another described the black storm that descended without warning, ripping through the air with a fury no one had imagined. In those few minutes, the convoy's careful formation turned chaotic. Destroyers swung their guns upward, spitting flak into the sky. But the Beaufighters were already gone, skimming low across the water and banking for another pass. The surprise had worked. Anti-aircraft gunners were silenced, bridges were wrecked, and the convoy was left bleeding, vulnerable, and exposed. But the attack had only just begun. Behind the Australians came the Americans. The modified B-25 Mitchells of the 38th Bomb Group had been waiting for this moment, flying in tight formation, their noses bristling, with 8 heavy machine guns. Each they swept in at wave-top height. Pilots gripped their controls, eyes locked on the transports ahead. "Keep it steady," one commander told his men. "Don't look at the flak, look at the target." The Japanese gunners scrambled to recover, firing wildly into the sky as the Mitchells bore down on them. But the sheer speed and ferocity of the attack was overwhelming. The first B-25 seconds opened up streams of tracer fire blazing across the water, hammering into ships' sides, ripping through gun crews, and smashing open-deck cargo. Survivors would later remember it as though the air itself had turned into knives. On one transport, sailors tried desperately to man a 25mm gun, only to be cut down before they could fire. Another crew watched helplessly as a bomb skipped across the waves, slammed into their ship, and exploded in a fireball that lifted men off the deck and threw them into the sea. The Australians had softened the convoy. The Americans were now tearing it apart. Pilots later described the chaos of those runs, flying so low that waves splashed against their windows so close to enemy ships that they could see faces frozen in shock. Bullets cracked past their cockpits, flak bursts lit the sky, but they pressed on, unleashing the full fury of their gunship noses. And yet, despite the carnage, the convoy pressed forward. Ships burned, but kept moving. Japanese officers shouted orders trying to regroup, trying to believe their escorts could still hold off the assault. But deep down, they knew the nightmare was only beginning. But the true test of the Americans' gamble hadn't even come yet, because the B-25 seconds still had to unleash their deadliest weapon, the skip-bombing run that would change naval warfare forever. The Beaufighters had left smoke and confusion trailing in their wake. Bridges were shattered, gunners dead or stunned, and transports were burning. But that was just the opening act. Now came the Americans flying the planes that everyone, especially the Japanese, had underestimated. The B-25 Mitchell was supposed to be a medium bomber, not a ship killer, not a terror at sea, just a reliable workhorse for mid-level bombing runs. Yet here it was transformed into something monstrous. 8 heavy machine guns protruded from the nose, 4 more on the sides with every trigger pull, spitting a storm of lead. To the crews inside, the world narrowed to a single task: charge straight at ships, bristling with guns, unleash every round they carried, and drop bombs so low they would skim across the water like stones. At 500 feet, the formations broke. Each bomber chose its target. The men locked eyes on destroyers, troop transports, and cargo ships lined up below. The Japanese gunners had recovered enough to fire, and streams of tracers shot upward, slicing the air. Pilots ducked instinctively, though there was nowhere to hide. "Stay low, stay on target," shouted Captain Ed Lerner, or Lenny, over the radio, as his formation bore down on the convoy. The first Mitchells opened fire. The 8-gun nozzles lit up every barrel, spewing flame and smoke. A river of tracers poured into the transports. Wooden decks shattered lifeboats. Disintegrated gun crews were cut down where they stood, some collapsing over their weapons as the guns continued firing blindly into the sea. One Japanese sailor later described it as if the sky itself turned into fire coming directly at us. He remembered the terrifying sight of a B-25 charging head-on, its guns blazing, the sound like a giant saw cutting through metal. At the same moment, the first bombs were released. Dropped just above the surface, they skipped once, twice across the waves before smashing into hulls. One transport shuddered under the impact, the explosion ripping a gaping hole in its side. Flames burst upward, swallowing men and cargo in a violent flash. Another bomb skipped over the bow of a destroyer, striking its stern and detonating so violently that the ship lifted out of the water before crashing back in. Inside the cockpits, the air crews felt the shock waves. "Pull up, pull up." One pilot screamed as water sprayed his windshield. Engines strained, wings rattled, and yet they kept going, coming around for another pass. On one run, Lieutenant Ed "Shaky" Parker aimed directly at a transport packed with troops. His gunners opened fire, first mowing down soldiers clustered near the rails. Then his bomb skipped once and slammed into the side of the ship. A fireball erupted, sending men flying into the sea. Parker's co-pilot, white-knuckled on the controls, muttered, "Dear God, it's like they're being sawed in half." Destroyers tried desperately to maneuver, throwing up walls of fire. Some managed to evade bombs, but every time they turned, another B-25 bore down, strafing their decks. Smoke poured from burning ships, filling the air with the stench of fuel and scorched metal. From above, the Japanese convoy no longer looked disciplined. It looked broken ships, scattering, zigzagging, leaving trails of fire and oil slicks behind them. Soldiers who had been laughing about clumsy bombers only days earlier were now diving into the water, desperate to escape the inferno around them. The American pilots had little time to think. They flew by instinct: aim, fire, release, climb. Every second mattered. One wrong move meant death. Yet time and again the tactics worked. The 8-gun noses cleared the decks. The skip bombs hit home. One by one, transports erupted into chaos. By the end of the assault, the convoy was in tatters. Flames lit the horizon, black smoke rising high into the sky. Survivors clung to wreckage, drifting helplessly. Destroyers that hadn't been sunk were circling wildly, trying to save men from the water. But the attacks kept coming, and for the Japanese commanders, the shock was complete. The medium bomber they had dismissed as harmless had just proven it could shred ships like paper. But the nightmare wasn't over yet, because what followed wasn't just the destruction of ships, but the annihilation of nearly every man who had sailed aboard them. By the afternoon of March 3rd, the Bismarck Sea had turned into a graveyard. Black smoke rose in thick columns, drifting across the water and staining the sky. Transports were burning from bow to stern, their decks twisted and broken, their hulls spilling oil and bodies into the waves. The sea itself seemed alive, with debris splintered, wood shattered, lifeboats, helmets, rifles, crates of supplies, and men, thousands of men. The Japanese convoy was no longer a convoy. It was a scattering of wrecks and desperate survivors. Every one of the 8 transports had been hit, some already sliding beneath the surface. 4 destroyers had gone down with them. The survivors clung to whatever they could: driftwood, rafts, even floating corpses. They shouted for help, their voices carrying across the smoke and flame. Some were calm, quietly waiting. Others screamed the panic of drowning and burning mixing in their throats. But the attacks did not stop. Allied pilots circled back, targeting any ship that still moved. Some bombers swooped low to strafe the waters where Japanese soldiers floated helplessly. It was brutal, merciless, and shocking even to some of the attackers. One pilot later admitted, "I could see their faces in the water. I fired anyway. If they reached Leh, we'd fight them again on land." Better to stop them here. For the Japanese trapped in the sea, there was no escape. Oil slicks spread across the water, catching fire in places where explosions had ruptured tanks. Survivors found themselves swimming through flames, coughing, choking, clawing for clean water. Others were dragged under by currents or sucked down when their ships sank. Destroyers that had survived tried to rescue men, pulling as many aboard as they could, but they were overwhelmed. Hundreds clung to their sides, begging for ropes. Japanese officers, grim and hardened, had to decide who could be saved and who would be left behind. Some pushed men away to prevent the ships from capsizing. For the Americans and Australians watching from above, it was a sight they would never forget. The sea was covered in dots, one gunner recalled, and then you realized the dots were men. Another described it more harshly. It looked like the ocean itself was bleeding. The scale of destruction stunned everyone. In just 2 days of strikes, the entire convoy had been wiped out. Not a single transport made it to Leh. Out of nearly 7,000 men who had boarded in Rabaul, only a fraction would ever reach the shore. Roughly 3,000 were killed outright in the attacks. Thousands more drowned or died in the aftermath. Those who did make it to land were so few that they posed no threat to Allied positions. For Japan, the loss was devastating, not just in manpower and supplies, but in morale. Their troops had believed they were protected, that their escorts and fighters could keep them safe. Instead, they had been slaughtered in a way they had never imagined by medium bombers charging in low firing like gunboats. The defeat shocked the Imperial Command, forcing them to rethink how they moved men and supplies in the Pacific. For the Allies, it was a triumph, but one tempered by the harshness of what they had done. Some pilots celebrated, cheering as ships exploded. Others sat quietly in their cockpits, staring at the devastation. They had won a major victory, but the cost in human lives, thousands drowning, screaming, begging in the water, was something that would haunt them. Reports later described how Japanese survivors floated for days, some washing up on shores, others vanishing into the endless Pacific. For the men who had once laughed at the thought of American bombers, it was a nightmare with no end. And yet the lesson was clear: innovation had turned the tide. The skip bombing tactic, once dismissed as reckless, had proven devastating. The B-25 Mitchell, once mocked, had become one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific. But the true weight of the battle wasn't measured in ships sunk. It was in what came after, when Japan abandoned major seaborne reinforcements to Leh and the Allies seized the initiative in New Guinea. By the afternoon of March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea had been violently transformed into a graveyard. Thick columns of black smoke clawed at the sky, staining it with the stench of oil and burning flesh. Where a proud convoy once sailed, now only twisted metal and broken decks remained, transports burning from bow to stern, spewing oil and countless bodies into the churning waves. The sea itself was a grotesque tapestry of debris. splintered wood, shattered lifeboats, discarded helmets, rifles, and horrifyingly, thousands upon thousands of men. The Japanese convoy was no more. It was a scattering of wrecks, surrounded by desperate survivors, clinging to anything that floated their cries for help, swallowed by the smoke and flames. The attacks, brutal and relentless, continued. Allied pilots, witnessing the carnage from above, swooped low, strafing the very waters where Japanese soldiers struggled for life. It was a merciless, shocking spectacle, even for some of the attackers. I could see their faces, one pilot later confessed, but I fired anyway. Better here than fighting them on land. For the Japanese trapped in that inferno, there was no escape. Oil slicks ignited, forcing men to swim through fire, coughing, choking, clawing for clean air as their ships slipped beneath the waves. The few destroyers that survived valiantly attempted rescues, but they were overwhelmed, forced to choose who would live and who would be abandoned to the depths. The scale of destruction was staggering, a victory bought with unimaginable human cost. In just 2 days, the entire convoy was annihilated. Not a single transport reached Leh. Out of nearly 7,000 men who had embarked with such confidence, only a fraction would ever touch shore again. Thousands were killed outright. Thousands more drowned or perished in the aftermath. For Japan, the blow was catastrophic, not just in manpower and materiel, but in the shattering of their morale and the fundamental trust in their naval protection. They had been massacred by the very medium bombers they had scorned, their invincible convoy, torn apart by charging gunships firing at mast height. The defeat sent shockwaves through the Imperial command, forcing a radical, humiliating reevaluation of their supply lines. For the Allies, it was a triumph, yet one forever etched with the grim reality of war. Pilots celebrated, yes, but many carried the silent, haunting images of exploding ships and men screaming in the water. General George Kenney's audacious gamble had paid off. His low-level tactics had redefined air-sea warfare. The B-25 Mitchell, once ordinary, now commanded fear. The skip bombing technique, once dismissed as reckless, became devastating doctrine. The true weight of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not merely in the ships sunk, but in the profound strategic shift that followed. Japan abandoned major seaborne reinforcements to Leh, eventually leading to its fall and fundamentally altering the course of the New Guinea campaign. When the smoke finally cleared and the last wreck vanished beneath the waves, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stood as a stark monument, a story of how reckless overconfidence can lead to utter destruction, how desperate innovation can turn the tide, and how the brutal machinery of war leaves indelible scars. It is a powerful reminder that history is not just about grand strategies, but about the individual courage and terror, the mistakes and lessons learned in the crucible of battle. The Japanese convoy, once proud and confident, left Rabaul, but it never reached Leh. Instead, it was erased from the sea, a chilling warning etched forever into the annals of history.